Wherever you are, and whatever hour has brought you here, I invite you to let the noise of the day fade away. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine a candle flickering in a quiet chamber. Its light is soft, golden and fragile, as if it is guarding a secret too ancient to be spoken aloud. Tonight, we begin a journey, not through the grand pages of history that kings and priests have written, but through the forgotten margins, the hushed whispers of a faith that once moved silently through the mountains and valleys of the Balkans. This is the story of the Bogomils. Their name is almost a shadow itself, nearly erased by time, nearly buried beneath centuries of silence. Yet if you lean closely, if you allow yourself to drift into the quiet rhythm of old Europe, you may still hear them, their voices, their prayers, their dreams, echoing faintly. To understand where they came from, we must first step into Byzantium. Not the glittering empire of mosaics and domes you may recall, but the Byzantium of the 10th century. A world of power and oppression, splendor and suffering. The empire stretched wide, ruled from Constantinople, the great city that called itself the Second Rome. Here, emperors wore robes of purple silk, and priests in golden vestments sang hymns beneath ceilings that shimmered with stars made of glass and stone. But beyond the walls of palaces and cathedrals, another world existed. The world of farmers, of shepherds, of villagers who lived by the earth and died by the sword or by hunger. Their lives were hard, and their voices rarely reached the chronicles. To them, the rituals of the imperial church often felt distant, grand, yes, but cold, unreachable, and perhaps even corrupt. And so, as twilight settles upon our tale, imagine those fields and forests of the Balkans. Picture the mist curling above riverbanks, the mountains standing silent in the distance. In little homes of wood and stone, people whispered questions. Why does suffering exist? Why do the rich feast while the poor go hungry? Why does the church, which claims to follow Christ, seem closer to the empire's throne than to the heart of the people? It was in this silence, in this aching space between faith and doubt, that something began to stir. A seed, fragile but alive. A seed that would grow into the Bogomil movement. The word Bogomil itself means beloved of God. Simple, gentle, almost tender. Not the name of a mighty army or a proud institution, but of a belief that spread quietly, like roots beneath the soil. According to tradition, it began with one man, a priest who looked at the world around him and could not remain silent. His sermons were not filled with pomp or ceremony. They were humble, spoken in the language of common people, not in the polished tones of the imperial liturgy. He spoke of light and darkness, of the struggle between good and evil, not as distant abstractions, but as realities felt in daily life. For the tired peasants who listened, his words were like water to the thirsty. They carried hope, but also defiance. Hope that the world of suffering was not the true creation of the good God. Defiance against the powers that claim to represent heaven while living in earthly luxury. And yet, dear listener, do not imagine this story rushing forward with battles and proclamations. No, not tonight. Let us move slowly, like moonlight crossing a quiet field. In this opening moment, all we need to do is to feel the atmosphere, the contrast between the shining palaces of Constantinople and the humble huts of the countryside, between the chanting choirs in marble churches and the murmured prayers of peasants in the dark. The Bogomils have not yet fully appeared in history. They are still forming, still a dream, still a whisper. But already the empire is uneasy. Already the guardians of orthodoxy sense that something is stirring, something they cannot quite name, but which carries the power to unsettle their order. So let us pause here with the candlelight still glowing softly. In the chapters to come, we will walk deeper into the world of the Bogomils, their beliefs, their journeys, their struggles, and the legacy they left behind. But for now, breathe slowly and let the shadows of Byzantium close gently around you. The night is long. The story has just begun. The candle we lit before still burns softly, its flame swaying with every quiet breath. Let us leave the marble walls of Byzantium behind and step instead into the damp earth of the countryside. Here, among the fields and forests, lies the world where the Bogomils were born. Picture a small village in the Balkans around the 10th century. The roofs are thatched, the walls built of wood and stone. The air smells of smoke from cooking fires, of soil freshly turned by weary hands. Chickens scratch in the dust, and children run barefoot across uneven paths. Life here is simple, but it is also harsh. For the peasants, each day begins with the sun and ends with exhaustion. They labor in the fields that rarely belong to them, for the land is owned by lords, monasteries, or the empire itself. Taxes are heavy, harvests uncertain, and winter always comes too soon. The empire's officials arrive with scrolls and seals demanding tribute. Priests come, speaking of salvation, yet their robes glimmer with wealth that no villager will ever know. It is in such a place that whispers are born, not the shouts of rebellion, not yet, only the soft questions spoken after nightfall when the day's work is done. Why must suffering exist if God is good? Why must gold decorate the churches while bread runs out at home? Why do the scriptures speak of Christ walking among the poor, yet his supposed servants live like kings? These questions, passed quietly from one household to another, carried the tone of both despair and longing. They were not the complaints of the faithless, but of those who wanted to believe more deeply. People yearned for a God who was closer, simpler, more compassionate, a God who could be found not in marble halls, but in the humble silence of the heart. And then, as if answering that yearning, a figure appeared, a priest, or perhaps only a wandering teacher. His name, tradition tells us, was Bogomil, the beloved of God. Unlike other priests, he carried no riches, no guards, no signs of imperial favor. His sermons were not delivered from gilded pulpits, but from doorsteps and meadows. He spoke in the language of the people, and his words did not soar into abstraction. They rested gently, like dew upon grass. The whisper of his teaching was simple, that the world is divided between light and darkness, and that true faith does not dwell in golden temples, but in the purity of the soul. He said the church had become too entangled with power, too enamored with wealth. He said God's love could be felt directly without the mediation of corrupt priests or distant emperors. For the villagers, these words were not only a challenge, they were a comfort. Imagine a weary mother sitting by the fire after a long day of toil, listening to a teaching that told her suffering was not her fault, nor was it the true will of God. Imagine a farmer who had given half his grain in taxes, hearing that the kingdom of heaven was not for emperors alone, but for those who lived humbly and faithfully. Such whispers spread quickly. They travelled not through scrolls or official decrees, but through stories told at wells, at market stalls, in the fields where men and women bent low to work. The empire may have tried to silence them, but whispers are hard to silence. They slip beneath doors, ride the wind, nestle into the hearts of those who are ready to hear. And so, slowly, quietly, a new faith began to take shape. It was not yet an institution, nor a movement with banners and names. It was simply a current of thought, a murmur in the dark, a breath of defiance against a world that seemed too heavy with injustice. Dear listener, let us pause here. The peasants did not know they were part of something that history would one day struggle to remember. To them, these whispers were as natural as the wind in the trees, as urgent as hunger, as sacred as prayer. But in these small, fragile beginnings, the seed of the Bogomil faith had been planted. The night deepens, the fire burns low, and the whisper continues, faint but unbroken. In the 10th century, as the Byzantine Empire flexed its power across the Balkans, a quiet figure began to move among the villages. His name was whispered as Bogomil, not so much a title of grandeur as a name of intimacy. The one beloved of God. Some believed he was a priest, disillusioned by the corruption of the church. Others said he was a humble villager, raised by hardship and lit by a spark of revelation. History does not give us his face, his exact birthplace, nor even the full weight of his words. Yet in the dim silence of forgotten chronicles, the essence of his teaching can still be traced. Bogomil's voice was different from the priests of Constantinople. It carried no thunder, no elaborate hymns rehearsed in choirs. Instead, it carried clarity. He spoke of two powers that shape the world, the God of light, eternal and good, and the Prince of darkness, the maker of the material world. This was not the theology of emperors, but of peasants who had long felt that the weight of the earth pressed cruelly upon them. The Bogomil teaching told them that their suffering was not the will of the true God. The harshness of their lives, the greed of officials, the hunger of their children, these belonged to the domain of the evil ruler, the shadow that held creation in its grasp. Yet above all this, untouched and pure, dwelled the God of light, who offered freedom to the soul. To listen to Bogomil was to believe that the world was not a hopeless prison, but a battleground, and that even the humblest soul could resist the chains of darkness. He rejected the opulence of the church. Where others bowed before icons covered in gold, Bogomil preached that the divine could not be captured in paint or jewels. Where the empire demanded obedience to bishops and patriarchs, he urged that God's voice was heard directly within the heart. He denied the rituals that the people could not afford, insisting instead on simplicity, prayer, purity, humility. The people listened, not because he thundered against power, but because he understood their pain. He walked with them, not above them. Imagine him in a field, standing before a circle of men and women in rough clothes, their hands scarred by labor. His words did not rise higher than their heads. They fell gently, like rain upon dry soil. "The true temple is here," he might have said, pressing a hand against his chest. "The true sacrifice is not of animals or coins, but of pride and cruelty. The kingdom of God is not in palaces, but in every soul that chooses light over darkness." For the villagers, it was both revelation and relief. They did not need to travel to Constantinople. They did not need to pay for sacraments or to bow before hierarchies. Their worth was not measured by wealth, but by the purity of their spirit. But such teachings, however gentle, carried danger. The Byzantine world was built upon unity of faith, upon obedience to the church. To suggest that the church itself was corrupt, to preach that salvation bypassed its authority, was more than heresy. It was rebellion. And rebellion, even in whispers, could not be tolerated. Yet Bogomil himself seemed untouched by fear. His life was modest, and those who followed him learned to live the same way. They ate little, spoke softly, avoided the trappings of luxury. Theirs was a faith of restraint, not of spectacle. In an age where power was measured by crowns and cathedrals, Bogomil measured truth by silence, humility, and endurance. Soon his followers multiplied. They were peasants, shepherds, farmers, and even a few who had once served in the clergy but grew weary of its corruption. They did not build churches of stone. Their gatherings were secret, in homes and fields, beneath trees and in the shelter of caves. There they recited prayers, shared bread, and spoke of the light that waited beyond the world's shadow. The empire would not remain blind to this movement. But in these early years, Bogomil himself stood at the center, calm as a flame that flickers yet does not die. His name became not just that of a man, but of a faith, a way of seeing the world. The soul of Bogomil lived in his teaching, and through his teaching, in the hearts of all who longed for freedom from the darkness. And though centuries would pass, and the empire's chronicles would try to erase his memory, that soul would continue to echo, faint but unbroken, in the forgotten corners of history. The Bogomil vision of the world was not wrapped in layers of abstract philosophy. It was simple, almost stark, like night and day, like shadow and flame. To understand it was to feel the tension of opposites that stretched across every life in the Balkans: hunger and plenty, cruelty and kindness, despair and hope. At its heart lay the teaching of dualism. The true God, the Father of light, was good, pure, and eternal. He was the creator of the spiritual world, a realm of harmony, truth, and unending peace. Yet the earth underfoot, the world of matter and pain, had not been shaped by him. No, it belonged to another, the dark prince, the false ruler. This world of flesh and soil, of palaces and prisons, of armies and famine, was a prison built by the adversary. For the peasants who listened to Bogomil teachings, this idea did not sound foreign. They already felt the world's cruelty pressing against them every day. How could a good God be the maker of hunger, of plague, of war? The official church said suffering was a test, a mystery of divine will. But Bogomils whispered, it was not the will of God at all. It was the shadow's doing. Light and darkness to them were not distant symbols. They were present in every moment of life. When a man cheated his neighbor, he served the Prince of Darkness. When a woman comforted a hungry child, she chose the kingdom of light. When the empire raised its taxes, it served the shadow. When the poor shared what little they had, they revealed the Father of light. This way of seeing the world gave clarity to the oppressed. Their struggles were not meaningless. They were part of a vast, invisible war. Every act of kindness became resistance. Every choice for purity, a blow against the darkness. The battlefield was not only in heaven or on earth, but within each soul. The Bogomils rejected the symbols of power the church adored. They saw no holiness in golden crosses or jeweled icons. To them, such objects were traps, distractions made by the enemy to bind people's faith to material things. True worship did not require candles in cathedrals, but a quiet heart turned to God in prayer. Sacraments, too, were questioned. Baptism by water, they said, was of no use. Only the baptism of spirit mattered. The Eucharist, performed with bread and wine, was to them an empty ritual when performed by corrupt priests. The true communion was the soul's bond with God, not the ceremony of altars. The empire's priests called this blasphemy. But for the people, it was liberation. They no longer needed to pay fees for rituals or rely on distant hierarchs for grace. Salvation was close as the breath in their lungs, the prayer in their hearts. This vision also demanded purity of life. Those most devoted, called the perfect, abstained from meat, riches, and marriage. They lived with restraint, walking softly upon the earth, refusing to add to its violence. Around them gathered the believers, ordinary men and women who admired their example and sought to follow as best they could. In this, the Bogomil faith carried both comfort and challenge. Comfort. because it explained suffering as the work of darkness, not of God. Challenge, because it called for lives of humility and sacrifice in a world already heavy with hardship. And yet, despite the weight of these teachings, they spread like a flame in dry grass. Perhaps because the Bogomils did not impose, but invited. Their words did not thunder, they whispered. Their faith did not demand monuments, it asked only for quiet hearts. In an empire filled with marble cathedrals and endless decrees, this softness was irresistible. But the empire watched. Every whisper carried risk. For if too many began to believe that the world belonged to darkness, what then of the emperor's throne? What then of the church's power? Dualism was not only a theology, it was a threat. The Bogomils, however, were not thinking of rebellion in the streets. They were thinking of light and shadow in the soul, of freedom beyond the grave, of truth hidden within silence. For them, salvation was not granted by bishops or emperors. It was chosen, moment, by aligning the heart with the Father of light. Thus, the world was divided, not by borders or armies, but by allegiance to light or to darkness. And in that division, a quiet revolution was beginning. The Bogomils lived in a world where the holy books were guarded by the church. Scriptures were written in languages few common people could read, copied in monasteries where gold paint filled the letters and jeweled covers locked the words away. To the empire, the Bible was not meant for peasants. It was a treasure of the clergy, interpreted from pulpits, controlled by authority. But among the Bogomils, the scriptures began to breathe differently. They were not relics wrapped in velvet. They were living words, carried from mouth to mouth, spoken in the language of the people. A parable remembered by a shepherd, a verse recited by a mother at her hearth, a teaching whispered in a quiet field. These became the true gospel. The Bogomils stripped away what they saw as distortions. Where the church had layered rituals, saints and ceremonies upon the story of Christ, they returned to simplicity. To them, the Gospels were not about power, hierarchy or ornament. They were about the eternal struggle between good and evil, about the call to live humbly, to reject violence, to seek the God of light in purity of spirit. Imagine a gathering in a low-roofed house, lit only by a small lamp. A man opens a worn piece of parchment, or perhaps he simply speaks from memory. He tells the story of Christ sending out his disciples with nothing but the clothes on their backs, with no gold or silver, no staff or sandals. The listeners nod slowly. To them, this is truth. This is how the messengers of God should live, not in palaces, not in silk, but in poverty and trust. Another time, a woman repeats the words of Jesus, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." She lingers on the line, letting it echo. For the villagers who own almost nothing, this is not poetry, it is promise. A kingdom not of emperors, but of those who endure. To the Bogomils, the scriptures were a mirror. They showed the corruption of the established church for what it was. Christ had overturned the tables of the money changers. Why then did bishops demand coins for sacraments? Christ had lived in simplicity. Why then did priests wear robes embroidered with gold? Christ had preached love and humility. Why then did the empire enforce faith with swords? Their interpretation was not scholarly. It was practical, immediate, and deeply human. They read, or listened, not as theologians, but as people whose lives hung on every word of hope. They did not care for debates on doctrine, but for the living example of Christ, the teacher who stood with the poor, who healed without charge, who rejected the powers of the world. This closeness to Scripture gave the movement strength. Every household could hold a piece of the story. No library could contain it, no bishop could control it, because it lived in memory and voice. The empire could burn manuscripts, but it could not silence the verses whispered in kitchens, fields, and mountain paths. The simplicity of their reading also shaped their practices. They rejected the veneration of saints, seeing it as a distraction from the true God. They dismissed the rituals that seemed theatrical, pointing instead to the Sermon on the Mount, to the parables of mercy and forgiveness. For them, the words of Christ were enough. This made them dangerous. The official church claimed authority by interpreting Scripture for the people, by mediating between heaven and earth. The Bogomils cut away that power. They declared that every soul could hear the truth directly, without priest or altar. In their hands, the Bible was no longer a locked chest. It was a seed, light enough to be carried anywhere, strong enough to grow in the poorest soil. And so the Scriptures became not just a book, but a song passed through the generations, carried by voices that refused to be silenced. Every verse remembered by heart was another spark of resistance, another shield against despair. The empire feared this, not because peasants knew a few verses, but because once they tasted the words as their own, they could no longer be controlled in the same way. Authority rested on mystery and distance. The Bogomils brought the sacred close into the hands of farmers and shepherds. And in that closeness, the whisper grew stronger. The Bible was no longer chained to altars. It walked barefoot among the fields, just as Christ once had. The Bogomils did not raise their voices in anger. They did not storm churches or tear down icons. Their rejection of the worldly church was quieter, yet more dangerous than open revolt. It was a refusal to believe, a decision to walk another path while the empire insisted there was only one. To them, the Byzantine church had betrayed its purpose. Instead of shepherding souls, it had bound itself to the empire's throne. Patriarchs blessed armies before they marched to war. Bishops lived in palaces, dining from golden plates, while peasants prayed on empty stomachs. The church demanded obedience to its sacraments, yet charged fees for them, turning holy grace into another form of tax. The Bogomils looked upon these rituals and saw emptiness. Baptism by water, they said, could not cleanse a soul. Only the baptism of spirit, invisible, inward, eternal, mattered. The Eucharist of bread and wine, performed by corrupt priests, was an illusion. True communion was not with elements placed on an altar, but with God directly, in prayer and purity. They rejected the veneration of icons. To bow before painted wood covered in gold seemed to them no different from idolatry. The God of light, they said, could not be captured by pigment or framed by jewels. Even the cross, the empire's symbol of triumph, was suspect. How could the instrument of Christ's death be exalted, they asked, when the true faith was in his life and his teaching? The rejection went further still. They denied the priesthood itself. A man in silk robes, ordained by other men, could not stand between a soul and its creator. Authority came not from rituals or offices, but from the purity of life. Any believer could pray. Any believer could seek forgiveness. The path to God was open, without tolls or gatekeepers. To the empire, this was treason. The church was not merely a spiritual institution, it was the glue that bound society. To question it was to weaken the emperor's rule, to unfasten the order of the world. Yet the Bogomils did not wield swords, nor banners, nor manifestos. They simply lived differently. Picture a village on Sunday morning. The bells of the church ring, calling the faithful to liturgy. Incense curls in the air, and the priest prepares to chant before his icons. But in one small house, a family does not go. They gather instead in their kitchen, bread on the table, heads bowed. Their prayer is quiet, spoken in their own tongue, with no priest to guide them. They believe their words rise directly to the Father of Light. Another evening, in a meadow, a group of villagers sits in a circle. One of the perfect speaks softly, reminding them that to follow Christ is to renounce greed, to live with mercy, to resist the darkness in daily choices. No candles, no gilded vestments, no icons, only the open sky and the murmur of faith. Such scenes multiplied, and with every household that chose silence over ceremony, every village that whispered its prayers without the church's blessing, the authority of the empire weakened. The Bogomils saw themselves not as rebels, but as restorers. They believed they were stripping away the layers of corruption to recover the original simplicity of Christ's teaching. To them, the official church was Rome remade in Byzantium, powerful, wealthy, entangled with politics. They wanted the faith of fishermen, of shepherds, of a teacher who walked barefoot and spoke of love, and yet this quiet rejection was enough to mark them as dangerous heretics. The empire could tolerate many things: political rivals, invading armies, even dissenting officials. But to undermine the unity of the church was to threaten the very soul of Byzantium. The Bogomils did not fight this accusation. They did not plead for acceptance. They continued to live as they believed, quietly, persistently, like water wearing away stone. The empire's priests declared them enemies of truth. But in the hearts of peasants, the truth felt closer than ever. The Bogomil faith spread not with armies or proclamations, but with footsteps. Quiet, steady footsteps that wound along mountain paths, crossed rivers, and slipped through forests under cover of night. Its messengers carried no banners, no scrolls stamped with imperial seals. They carried only memory, only words, and a way of life that spoke more loudly than any decree. These were the perfect men and women who had chosen to live without possessions, without family ties, without the pleasures of the world. They travelled lightly, eating little, dressed simply, with nothing to betray their purpose but the light in their eyes. To see them was to see poverty, yet to listen was to hear freedom. They walked from village to village, never staying long, never drawing attention. A handful of followers would gather in a barn, a clearing, or a humble cottage. There, by lamplight or starlight, they would hear again the teaching of the two powers, the call to resist the darkness of the world, the invitation to live with mercy and restraint. Then, as quietly as they had come, the teachers would leave, vanishing into the night. The Balkans, with their rugged mountains and deep valleys, sheltered these journeys. Paths known only to shepherds became the highways of the faith. Caves hidden in the cliffs served as meeting places. Rivers carried whispers downstream, spreading news faster than the empire could contain it. The empire's officials knew something was stirring. Reports reached bishops and governors, villages refusing to attend church, peasants whispering heresies, households gathering in secret. But when soldiers arrived, they found no temples, no altars, no leaders to arrest. The Bogomil teachers were already gone, their traces erased like footprints in the rain. For the villagers, these visits were more than sermons. They were moments of light in lives otherwise bound by toil. Imagine a farmer, weary from the fields, hearing that his suffering was not divine punishment, but the work of darkness, and that his soul still belonged to the God of light. Imagine a widow, long ignored by the church, being told she could pray without priest or payment, and that her words rose as purely as any bishop's chant. These moments were liberation, and they lingered long after the messengers had departed. The secret journeys also bound the scattered faithful together. A village in Macedonia might feel alone in its whisper of defiance, until a traveling teacher told them of others. In Serbia, in Bosnia, even across the mountains where new communities were forming. Each visit was a thread, and together these threads wove a hidden network of belief that stretched across the Balkans. Danger was constant. The empire had ears everywhere, and priests loyal to Constantinople warned of heretics who deceived the people. To be caught was to face trial, condemnation, perhaps even death by fire. Yet still they walked, trusting not in protection of armies, but in the shelter of silence and the loyalty of those they taught. Stories grew around these journeys. Some said the perfect could heal with a touch, or that their prayers calmed storms. Others said they needed no food for days, living only on the spirit. Whether true or not, such tales gave them an air of mystery, making their arrival both feared and longed for. And so the faith spread. Not like wildfire, sudden and bright, but like roots beneath the soil, unseen yet relentless. Every journey added another circle of listeners, another memory carried from mouth to mouth. When one teacher disappeared, another arrived. When one community fell silent under pressure, another whispered louder. In time, the Bogomil way stretched from Macedonia into Serbia, from Serbia into Bosnia, until much of the Balkan countryside pulsed with hidden life. The empire might rule the land with soldiers and priests, but in the hearts of the peasants, another kingdom was already growing. Quiet, invisible, but enduring. The journeys never ceased. They were the lifeblood of the movement, the unseen paths where faith walked lightly, whispering of light in a world heavy with shadow. The Bogomil faith had no citadels to defend, no towers to fall, no banners to be torn down. It survived not by strength of walls, but by the endurance of whispers. That was both its weakness and its power. As the 10th and 11th centuries unfolded, the empire became increasingly aware of the movement spreading beneath its surface. Reports reached Constantinople, villages where peasants no longer respected priests, regions where people refused to pay for sacraments, communities where the church's voice carried less weight than the soft speech of wandering teachers. To the guardians of orthodoxy, this was no small matter. Heresy was a contagion, and if left unchecked, it could unravel the empire's unity. So came decrees. Bishops wrote warnings condemning the heretics. Synods gathered to denounce their doctrines. Some imperial officials were dispatched to root out the whispers. Yet still, the Bogomils endured. Like smoke curling through cracks in stone, they slipped past efforts to contain them. The flame smouldered because it did not depend on one leader or one place. Bogomil himself, the man whose name had given life to the faith, fades almost completely from history after his first appearance. Perhaps he died quietly, perhaps he was silenced by force. No one knows. But the movement did not end with him. His teachings had already taken root, and roots do not vanish with the fall of one tree. Imagine a village under watch, soldiers demanding loyalty to the church, priests lecturing against heresy. Outwardly, the people obey. They attend liturgy, they nod when the priest speaks. But at night, in kitchens lit by embers, they whisper prayers not to the icons on the wall, but to the unseen Father of Light. Their outward compliance masks an inner defiance like coals glowing beneath ash. In other places, persecution was harsher. Some were dragged before councils, accused of denying the sacraments, of insulting the cross, of rejecting the authority of bishops. Condemnations were swift, punishment severe. Yet even when a few were silenced, others remained. The Bogomil faith was not a fortress to be breached. It was a fire scattered into many sparks, too small to extinguish all at once. The flame endured because it spoke to what people already felt. The peasants did not need to be convinced that the world was unjust. They saw it in every tax collector, every famine, every priest who lived richly while they starved. The Bogomil teaching gave a name to that injustice, darkness, and a hope beyond it, light. That hope was hard to kill. The empire fought with councils and armies, but the Bogomils fought with silence, simplicity, and patience. They did not resist openly, but neither did they surrender. They bent like grass in the wind, yet their roots held firm. Over time, whole regions began to feel their presence. Bosnia, especially, became a place where the Bogomil flame glowed more openly. In the valleys and hills, entire communities leaned toward the teaching, shaping a culture where the empire's grip was weaker. Elsewhere, the faith spread more cautiously in smaller circles, hidden and fragile. But always it persisted. Those who followed the Bogomil way often described themselves not as rebels, but as keepers of truth. They believed the Church of the Empire was a house of shadows and that their task was simply to preserve the light. This gave them a quiet strength, a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. Even when threatened, they could endure, because they believed the struggle was not theirs alone, but part of the eternal war between good and evil. The smouldering flame was not bright enough to light the empire, but it was never extinguished. Year after year, village after village, it lingered, hidden, fragile, and yet alive. And like any flame, though small, it could leap higher when fed by wind. The wind was coming. Ideas, unlike armies, do not need borders to open gates. They slip through trade routes, across mountain passes, and along the tongues of travelers. The Bogomil faith, born in the villages of the Balkans, did not remain confined there. In time, its whispers travelled far west until they found new soil in the lands of southern France, where they would rise again as the Cathar movement. The path was not a single road, but many. Merchants carried more than spices and cloth, they carried stories. Pilgrims travelled between holy sites, sharing tales of strange preachers and hidden gatherings. Soldiers, mercenaries and wanderers moved from the Balkans into Italy, from Italy into Languedoc. Each step, each conversation, was a thread that bound distant lands together. The Balkans were a crossroads of empire, touched by Byzantium, by Bulgaria, by Latin traders, even by Muslim merchants passing through. In such a place, nothing remained isolated. What began as a local descent soon became a current flowing westward, carried by unseen hands. In northern Italy, small circles of believers began to echo the Bogomil teaching. They questioned the wealth of the church, the power of priests, the worth of rituals performed by corrupt hands. They sought purity in simplicity, spirit above matter. Whether they knew the name Bogomil or not, the rhythm of the teaching had reached them. From Italy, the current drifted further into the fertile valleys and walled towns of Languedoc. This was a land different from the iron grip of Byzantium, a land of troubadours and merchants, where tolerance and trade created a softer soil for ideas to take root. There, the whisper of an alternative faith did not immediately meet the sword. It found listeners among peasants weary of tithes, but also among nobles curious for freedom from Rome's shadow. The messengers who carried the faith westward were not generals or bishops. They were the same quiet travellers who had always borne it, poor, simple men and women who walked lightly on the earth. They carried no books, for books could be burned. They carried no treasures, for treasures could be stolen. They carried memory, the memory of a dual world, of the struggle between light and darkness, and of the path of purity that freed the soul. One can imagine such a messenger arriving in a small Italian town. Perhaps he speaks to a weaver in the marketplace, sharing the story of how the true church is not of stone, but of spirit. The weaver listens and tells his family that night. Weeks later, another traveller confirms the same teaching, and a small circle forms. Quiet, fragile, but alive. As these circles spread, they began to call themselves by other names. In France, the word Cathar would eventually take hold, meaning the pure ones. Yet behind the name, the echo of the Bogomils remained. The rejection of worldly church, the denial of sacraments, the belief in a dual world, the emphasis on living simply and purely, all bore the fingerprints of their Balkan ancestors. It is important to see that the Bogomils did not send armies westward, nor did they write manifestos to persuade. Their gift to the West was quieter, like embers carried in the folds of travelers' cloaks, embers that would later burst into flame. And in this journey lies a kind of paradox. The Bogomils were almost erased from history, their names scarcely remembered, their writings lost or destroyed. Yet through their influence they became ancestors of one of medieval Europe's most famous heresies. Their own story faded, but their spirit lived on. In the Cathars, in the defiance of Languedoc, and in the memory of those who dreamed of a purer faith. The path from the Balkans to Occitania was long, winding, and often invisible. But the flames smouldered across mountains and seas, carried not by armies, but by whispers. When the whispers of the Bogomils reached Occitania, they did not remain unchanged. No idea ever does. Like seeds carried by wind, they took root in different soil, under different skies, and grew into forms both familiar and new. In the towns and valleys of Languedoc, the movement that blossomed would one day be called Catharism, a mirror to the Bogomil faith, reflecting its light but also refracting it into new colors. The Cathars shared the Bogomil suspicion of the worldly church. They too looked at priests clothed in wealth and saw betrayal. They too refused the sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, calling them empty when performed by corrupt hands. They too turned from the veneration of crosses and icons, seeing only idolatry where the church claimed holiness. Yet in their dualism, the Cathars sharpened the teaching. The Bogomils had spoken of two principles, light and darkness, with room for ambiguity, with shades of interpretation. The Cathars, in their Western clarity, made the divisions starker. For them, the world was not merely corrupted by evil. It was the very creation of the evil principle. Matter itself was the prison of the soul. This sharper vision gave rise to new practices. Where Bogomil teachers lived simply, Cathar perfecti lived with an almost radical purity. They renounced meat, wealth, and sexual relations entirely. They practiced the consolamentum, a single rite of spiritual baptism that replaced all other sacraments, performed once in a lifetime. To receive it was to step into a life of purity, or to die in that state, one's soul freed from the cycle of material bondage. In this, one hears the echo of the Bogomils, but louder, more defined. It was as though the seed planted in Balkan soil had grown wild among Occitan hills, stretching taller, bearing fruit more visible to friend and foe alike. And yet the Cathars also reflected the gentleness of their ancestors. They preached without force, refusing to swear oaths, to kill, to shed blood. Like the Bogomil perfect, they walked lightly, 2 by 2, through towns and villages, teaching that the soul could rise above the world of shadows. Their humility drew respect even from those who called them heretics. Many in Languedoc admired their honesty, their refusal of wealth, their calm endurance. To the peasants of France, the Cathars offered freedom from the crushing demands of Rome. To the nobles, they offered a way to resist the papacy's power without raising armies. And to the common heart, they offered something older and simpler, a path of purity, a faith untied from rituals and taxes, a direct connection to the divine. But mirrors do more than reflect, they distort. The Cathars, in sharpening the Bogomil vision, also made it more threatening to the established order. In Byzantium, The Bogomils had been a quiet flame smouldering beneath the surface. In Occitania, the Cathars became a visible blaze. Their numbers grew, their teachings spread openly, and their communities flourished so brightly that they could not be ignored. In the end, the Cathars would suffer more violently than the Bogomils ever had. Yet even in their tragedy, one sees the inheritance of the Balkans. Without the Bogomils, the Cathar faith might never have existed. Without the first whispers in hidden villages, there might never have been the great cry in Languedoc. Thus the Cathars were not simply an imitation. They were a mirror, reflecting the Bogomil spirit, but also shaping it, intensifying it, and returning it to the world in a new form. The Balkans had lit the ember. Occitania made it a flame. Persecution does not always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it begins as a whisper, a shadow at the edge of the village, a decree written far away but carried on the lips of a priest who frowns when the people no longer obey. For the Bogomils, persecution began quietly. Bishops denounced them in sermons, branding them heretics, corrupters of souls, enemies of the true church. The words reached ears already suspicious, already anxious. Some neighbors began to watch neighbors, wondering who prayed in secret, who rejected the sacraments. Suspicion itself became a weapon, dividing villages, planting unease in once peaceful communities. But the empire could not rely only on whispers. In Constantinople, the patriarch and the emperor agreed. Heresy was not merely a religious stain, but a political threat. If peasants could reject the sacraments, what else might they reject? Taxes, laws, the emperor's authority itself? So, councils were called. Synods condemned the Bogomil faith. Orders were given to root it out. Soldiers arrived in villages. Houses were searched. Those accused were dragged to cities for questioning. Some were forced to renounce their beliefs publicly. Others were punished more harshly. The chronicles hint at imprisonments, at burnings, at executions meant to frighten the faithful back into obedience. Yet persecution has a paradoxical effect. It silences some, but it strengthens others. For each family that abandoned the teaching in fear, another clung to it more fiercely, convinced that suffering proved the truth of their path. Like iron tested in fire, the Bogomil faith hardened under pressure. And far to the west, in Languedoc, the Cathars began to feel the same breath of suspicion. At first, they lived openly, speaking in marketplaces, welcomed into noble courts, respected even by those who disagreed with them. But word travelled to Rome. Reports reached the papacy that in southern France an entire alternative faith was flourishing, unchecked, even admired. At first, Rome responded with words. Councils declared the Cathars heretics. Priests were sent to debate them, to argue the truth of Catholic doctrine. Yet the debates often ended with audiences more impressed by the humility and purity of the Cathars than by the authority of Rome's envoys. Whispers grew louder. The Cathars were not simply eccentric preachers, they were a danger. They threatened the unity of Christendom, the authority of the Pope, the very structure of society. For if men and women could live without priests, without sacraments, without church authority, what need was there for the towering edifice of Rome? The Bogomils knew this tension well. By the 11th century, they had endured decades of persecution, sometimes harsh, sometimes lax, but never gone. Their communities survived in silence, hidden among the hills, lingering in Bosnia, where imperial power was weakest. They had learned to live with persecution as one lives with storms, bracing for the worst, enduring in stillness, waiting for the sky to clear. The Cathars, by contrast, had not yet learned this lesson. Their movement was still rising, still bold, still open. They spoke with confidence in courts and cities, not realizing how deeply their light unsettled the darkness of authority. They were admired, yes, but admiration can quickly turn to fear, and fear to violence. Thus, in two lands far apart, the same story began to unfold. In the Balkans, the Bogomils whispered prayers in secret, hiding from imperial soldiers. In Languedoc, the Cathars spoke boldly, unaware that soon the weight of Rome would fall upon them. Persecution, once a whisper, was gathering breath. The storm was coming. Persecution, once a whisper, became a proclamation. Words written on parchment, stamped with seals, read aloud in churches, carried from court to village. These were the burning edicts that declared heresy not just an error, but a crime. In Byzantium, the orders were clear. The Bogomils were to be sought out, exposed and punished. Councils condemned them as servants of the devil. Priests warned congregations that to harbor or aid a Bogomil was to share in their sin. Soldiers entered villages with lists of names, and fires were kindled in public squares where those accused were forced to repent or perish. The chronicles tell of Bogomil leaders brought to Constantinople itself. Some were tried before emperors, accused of defying the church and corrupting the faithful. One account describes a Bogomil elder burned alive for refusing to renounce his faith, his ashes scattered as a warning. These spectacles were meant to frighten the movement into silence. Yet silence is a strange thing. It can be born of fear, but it can also be the soil where endurance grows. For every fire that consumed a Bogomil body, the memory of their steadfastness lit another hidden flame in the hearts of those who watched. Centuries later, in the rolling hills of Languedoc, the same pattern unfolded. The Cathars, once tolerated, admired even, began to face Rome's tightening grip. Papal legates declared them heretics. Local lords who sheltered them were warned, threatened with excommunication. Edicts spread through France. Those who followed the Cathar way were enemies of the faith and enemies of God. At first, these were words, but words carry weight when backed by the authority of Rome. In some towns, Cathars were arrested, dragged before bishops, and pressed to recant. A few did, bowing under pressure. Others stood firm, and for them the punishment was harsher. Fires were built in marketplaces, and the condemned were tied to stakes. Imagine the scene. Villagers gathered by order, priests chanting, soldiers standing guard. A Cathar perfecti, thin and calm, stands as the flames rise. He does not curse, he does not scream. He sings a prayer, his voice steady until the smoke silences him. For those who watch, the lesson is clear. Rome demands obedience. But another lesson lingers, quieter, more dangerous, that a man or woman could face fire without fear because they believed their soul already belonged to the realm of light. Thus, across centuries and across continents, the same edicts burned. The Empire of Byzantium declared the Bogomils a danger to order. The Church of Rome declared the Cathars a danger to salvation. In both cases, authority sought to crush dissent with fire and fear. And yet, both fires failed to consume the faith entirely. The Bogomils, though diminished, endured in Bosnia, where imperial reach was weaker. There, in valleys and mountains, their communities continued, stubborn as stone. The Cathars, though hunted, continued to spread in southern France, their purity admired, their teachings whispered even in noble courts. The burning edicts were meant to end the story. Instead, they became a new chapter. For persecution, though terrible, often gave the movements a strange strength. The faithful looked at their suffering not as defeat, but as proof that the world of darkness feared the truth of their light. and so the fires blazed in Byzantium and in France. Bodies turned to ash, but ideas, like smoke, drifted beyond reach. The edicts burned paper and flesh, but not memory. The memory endured. Between the mountains and rivers of Bosnia, the Bogomil faith found what it had long been denied: room to breathe. Here, where imperial power was weaker and church authority stretched thin, the movement grew roots deep enough to survive when elsewhere it was fading into silence. Bosnia was a land apart. Its valleys were rugged, its villages scattered, its hills dense with forests that shielded travelers from prying eyes. To outsiders, it was a frontier, difficult to govern, far from the gleaming courts of Constantinople or Rome. To the Bogomils, it was a sanctuary, a place where the whisper of faith could swell into a quiet chorus. Here, the Bogomil way became more than a scattered circle of believers. It began to resemble a church of its own, though not of stone and gold, not of bishops and cathedrals. Instead, it was a fellowship of believers who met in fields, in cottages, in secluded glens. They had no altars but the earth, no incense but the wind, no music but their own voices raised in prayer. Imagine a family in a Bosnian valley. At dusk, they light a small fire outside their home. Neighbors gather, not for a feast, but for prayer. A teacher speaks of the eternal struggle, of the world's corruption, of the light that calls the soul home. The words are familiar, spoken in their own tongue, not in the distant liturgical Greek of Byzantium. Children listen, their eyes wide, their hearts catching a flame that no empire can extinguish. In time, even Bosnian rulers began to show sympathy. Some historians suggest that local nobles found in the Bogomils a faith that matched their independence from foreign powers. Aligning with them was both a spiritual choice and a political statement, a way to resist the heavy hand of both Byzantium and Rome. Whether from conviction or convenience, the effect was the same. The Bogomil flame was sheltered, allowed to glow more openly than in the neighboring lands. This hidden kingdom did not raise armies, nor did it crown kings. Its strength was not in fortresses, but in resilience, in the stubborn loyalty of its followers. And in this loyalty, the Bogomil faith transformed Bosnia. For centuries it shaped the region's religious life, so much so that later observers could scarcely tell where Bogomil belief ended and Bosnian identity began. Travelers from abroad noticed. Priests sent from Rome wrote worried letters about heresy flourishing unchecked in Bosnia. They described entire communities living outside the authority of the Catholic Church, rejecting its sacraments, its hierarchy, its power. To them, Bosnia was a land infected by heresy, a dangerous wound in Christendom. But to those who lived within it, Bosnia was something else. It was proof that the faith could survive, even thrive, in the face of persecution. While fires burned in Byzantium, while edicts thundered in France, the valleys of Bosnia held a quiet endurance. Here, the Bogomils built not a worldly kingdom, but a hidden one, a kingdom of spirit, bound not by borders but by belief. Of course, this hidden kingdom would not last forever. In time, crusades would march, empires would shift, and the Bogomil faith would face new trials. But for a time, in the heart of Bosnia, the movement that had nearly vanished elsewhere lived strongly enough to shape the course of history. The hidden kingdom was not marked on maps, yet in its silence it bore witness to a truth the Bogomils had always held, that the kingdom of God is not built of stone nor held by armies, but lives within the hearts of those who seek the light. In the hills and valleys of Languedoc, a different world blossomed. It was not the stern piety of Rome, nor the rigid order of Byzantium. It was a land alive with music, with poetry, with laughter carried on warm winds from the Mediterranean. Here, troubadours wandered from court to castle, singing of love, of longing, of honor. And into this melody of life, the voices of the Cathars wove their own harmonies. The troubadours were not priests nor prophets, but poets. They sang of earthly love with a reverence that felt almost sacred. They praised beauty, courtesy, and devotion, often lifting the human heart to something higher, gentler, freer. And in their songs, listeners heard an echo of what the Cathars taught: that the truest love was not bound by possession, not chained to the corruption of flesh, but pointed to something beyond. It is no wonder that the two currents flowed together. The courts of Languedoc, where troubadours found patrons, were also the places where Cathar teachers were welcomed. Noble ladies, versed in poetry and music, listened with equal interest to the words of the perfecti, who spoke of purity, compassion, and the rejection of worldly corruption. The same ears that delighted in songs of chivalric love also heard the invitation to a higher spiritual love. Imagine an evening in a hall lit by torches. A troubadour strums his lute, singing of a lady's beauty, of a knight's devotion. The company listens, swaying with the rhythm. When the song ends, another voice rises, softer, calmer. A Cathar perfecti speaks of the soul's beauty, of devotion not to a lady, but to the light of God. The hall grows quiet, the fire crackles, and for a moment, poetry and heresy share the same breath. This mingling gave the Cathar faith a unique charm. It was not only a rebellion against Rome, it was part of a larger spirit in Languedoc, a spirit that valued freedom, creativity, and the dignity of the human heart. The people of this land were not easily cowed by distant decrees. They had built a culture where questioning was natural, where alternative voices could sing. To Rome, this was troubling. The troubadours were tolerated, even celebrated, but when their world overlapped with heresy, the problem deepened. Songs could travel faster than armies. Ideas dressed in melody could slip past suspicion, carried from court to village, from castle to town square. If poetry and heresy danced together, who could stop their rhythm? For a time, though, it was golden. The Cathars found in Languedoc a soil as rich as Bosnia had been for the Bogomils, but brighter, more open. Here they did not need to hide in caves or whisper in kitchens. They could walk in daylight, welcomed into halls where music and debate flourished side by side. Some troubadours, historians say, may have even woven Cathar sympathies into their songs, cloaking spiritual longing in the language of earthly desire. Whether true or not, the atmosphere was one of harmony, poets and preachers, music and faith, both reaching beyond the rigid walls of the official church. It was a fragile harmony, though, for Rome could not long ignore a land where heresy was not merely surviving but flourishing, mingled with art, celebrated in courts, admired by nobles. To the papacy, Languedoc became not a garden of poetry, but a vineyard of rebellion. The songs of troubadours, once charming, now seemed dangerous when they echoed in the same halls that sheltered heretics. But in those years before the storm, the land of Languedoc was radiant. Troubadours sang, perfecti preached, and the people listened with open hearts. It was a world where music and heresy danced together, unaware that soon both would be silenced by fire and steel. The bells did not ring for joy that summer. They rang as warnings, echoing from tower to tower, carrying fear across the hills of Languedoc. The crusade had begun. Rome had run out of patience. For years, papal envoys had written of a land where heresy walked openly, where nobles protected Cathar teachers, where peasants honored the perfecti as saints while scorning priests of the church. At first there had been councils, debates, excommunications, but none of it had broken the faith of Languedoc. And then a papal legate was murdered, an envoy of Rome cut down in a land already under suspicion. That blood was enough to ignite war. Pope Innocent III called upon the knights of Christendom, not to march to the Holy Land, but to turn their swords inward against their fellow Christians, to cleanse Languedoc of heresy, to wipe out the Cathars, to restore the authority of Rome. It was a crusade not across seas, but across familiar fields, against neighbours who prayed differently. The armies that gathered were vast. Warriors from the north of France, banners of noble houses, hardened knights, eager for both salvation and spoils. To join the crusade was to gain indulgence, the promise of forgiveness for sins. And in Languedoc, rich lands lay waiting, ripe for conquest. Faith and greed marched side by side beneath the sign of the cross. For the people of Languedoc, the coming storm was unimaginable. Imagine a village at dawn, smoke curling from chimneys, the sound of roosters rising with the sun. Then a distant thunder, not of storms, but of hooves, of hundreds of horses. Dust on the horizon, banners glinting in the light. Mothers clutch children, fathers gather what little they can carry. But where can they flee? The armies are everywhere, pressing south, pressing east, pressing west. The first great horror came at Béziers. The town refused to hand over its Cathar heretics, and so the Crusaders attacked. When the city fell, no distinction was made between believer and bystander, between heretic and faithful. "Kill them all," the chroniclers say the Crusades' leader ordered. "God will know his own." And so the streets ran red. Thousands were slaughtered. Peasants, priests, children, the old. Fire consumed houses, smoke blackened the sky. Béziers was left in silence, a warning written in ash. The news spread faster than the Crusaders themselves. Villages heard of Béziers and trembled. Some opened their gates, hoping mercy might be shown. Others fled to the hills, hiding in caves and forests. But the armies pressed on, relentless. Carcassonne fell, then other towns. Each conquest tightened Rome's grip. Each massacre silenced another community. Yet not all submitted. Some nobles resisted, rallying their people to defend their lands. Behind castle walls, the faithful gathered, praying as stones and fire rained down from siege engines. Inside, Cathar perfecti walked among them, offering comfort, reminding them that death in purity was not defeat, but liberation. To the besieged, the crusade was not just war. It was the world of darkness made flesh, battering their gates, seeking to extinguish the light they carried. For those who survived, the crusade was not a story of armies and banners, but of fear carved into memory. A mother hiding her children in a barn, praying the soldiers would not find them. A villager digging a pit in the forest to bury sacred texts before the flames came. A Cathar perfecti, captured, refusing to renounce his faith even as the fire was lit around him. The crusade had begun, and it would not end quickly. For 20 years, the armies of Rome and the north would scour Languedoc, burning, besieging, and killing. The land of poetry and heresy, once bright with troubadour songs, was now filled with the sound of swords, screams, and crackling fire. The storm had broken, and in its shadow, a way of life was being erased. When the fields of Languedoc burned, when villages fell and the troubadour songs fell silent, hope retreated to the mountains. There, upon high ridges and sheer cliffs, stood the castles of defiance. Their stones seemed to grow out of the rock itself, fortresses of air and sky, daring the crusaders to climb. Minerve, Montségur, Quéribus, Peyrepertus, names that still cling to the wind like echoes of a song half forgotten. To the Cathars, these were more than castles. They were sanctuaries of the spirit, arks built of stone, where the faithful gathered to wait out the storm. At Minerve, the people crowded within the walls, watching the crusaders approach. Siege engines rolled across the hills, catapults creaking, stones hurled like thunderbolts. The defenders fought with courage, hurling rocks of their own, pouring boiling water, refusing to yield. But walls, however strong, cannot last forever under the weight of an army. When Minerve fell, hundreds of Cathar believers were offered a choice: renounce their faith or burn. They chose the fire. One by one, men and women stepped forward, calm, resolute, entering the flames as if into baptism. Witnesses remembered their singing as the smoke swallowed them. Montségur became the brightest star of defiance. Perched on a peak so high it seemed to touch the heavens, it was both fortress and beacon. There, the last great gathering of Cathar Perfecti took place. They lived in prayer, in simplicity, even as they knew the armies would come. For months, the siege dragged on. Crusaders surrounded the mountain, building wooden towers, launching arrows, trying to cut off every path of escape. Inside, the Cathars endured, hearts fixed not on survival, but on fidelity. And yet even stone cannot resist forever. By treachery or sheer attrition, the walls were breached. In March of 1244, Montségur fell. More than 200 Cathars were captured, and once again the same grim choice was offered: recant or burn. They chose as those at Minerve had chosen. A great pyre was built at the foot of the mountain, and into it they walked, hand in hand, voices joined in prayer. Smoke rose from Montségur, black against the blue sky, a signal to the world that the light of the Cathars would not bow even in death. These castles were not only places of defense, they became symbols of what it meant to resist. For centuries afterward, their ruins whispered of that defiance. Stones crumbled, ivy crawled over broken walls, but memory clung tighter than any vine. Pilgrims, poets, and wanderers looked at those heights and saw not just ruins, but shrines, reminders of a faith that had faced the full weight of empire and fire and still refused to bend. Yet, what did it mean, this defiance? To Rome, it was heresy, stubborn and dangerous, needing to be uprooted to save Christendom. To the Cathars, it was faithfulness, a refusal to betray the truth even when surrounded by armies. To those caught in between, villagers and peasants drawn into wars they did not choose, it was tragedy. Sons and fathers slain, daughters and mothers burned, homes reduced to ash. Standing among the ruins today, one can almost hear the cries of the besieged, the crack of stones hurled against walls, the final prayers whispered as torches touched the wood. But one can also feel the stillness that lingers, a stillness that honors the dead. Montségur's peak, Minerve's cliffs, the shattered crowns of Cheribus and Peyrepertusi. They are not only reminders of defeat, but of courage. They are the scars of a people who, though crushed, never surrendered their faith. The castles of defiance stood against the crusade as long as stone and human will allowed. And when they fell, they did not simply vanish. They left behind a legend, a fire smouldering in memory that even centuries could not extinguish. When the castles fell and the pyres cooled, the Crusaders might have thought their work complete. But Rome understood that stone and sword alone could not erase belief. Faith is not always loud. It can hide in whispers, in glances, in a mother's lullaby. And so a new weapon was forged, not of steel, but of suspicion. The Inquisition. It began quietly. Papal orders established tribunals across Languedoc, staffed by men of learning and unyielding conviction. They were not soldiers, but their presence could chill a village more deeply than an armed host. The inquisitors carried no lances, but they carried books, registers, records, questions sharpened like blades. Their task was not to conquer land, but to conquer memory. The process was deliberate. A town would be summoned. Villagers called before the tribunal one by one. Questions asked, carefully, persistently. Have you seen a Cathar? Have you heard their teachings? Did you give bread, or water, or shelter to one? No answer was safe. To confess was to damn oneself. To deny was to risk being accused by another. Fear spread like smoke through the streets. Witnesses were turned against neighbors, neighbors against friends, even children against their parents. Silence itself became dangerous. If one said too little, suspicion grew. If one said too much, suspicion grew as well. The inquisitors knew the art of weaving webs, where a single word could snare an entire family. And when suspicion hardened into certainty, there was no mercy. Those judged guilty were paraded before the people, marked as heretics. Some were given the chance to recant, to wear humiliating garments, to live the rest of their days as examples of Rome's authority. Others were sent to the flames, their ashes scattered as warnings. The fires of the crusade had been wild and furious. The fires of the Inquisition were colder, more precise, but no less consuming. Imagine a village after the inquisitors departed. The square empty, save for charred wood where a pyre had stood. Doors closed tightly, shutters drawn. Conversations hushed. Faith, once spoken in song and prayer, now hidden deep inside. A child asks a mother why their neighbors are gone, and the mother silences the child with a glance, for even questions could be dangerous. The Inquisition was not only about punishment, it was about reshaping memory. Chronicles were rewritten, songs silenced, the very idea of the Cathars recast as evil, demonic, unworthy of remembrance. The goal was not only to kill the body of the faith, but its ghost, to erase even the possibility that it had once lived. And yet, ghosts linger. The people of Languedoc carried memory in ways the inquisitors could not touch. A whispered story here, a carved symbol there, an old melody hummed softly when no one was listening. The faith that had once filled halls and castles was reduced to embers, but embers can smolder for generations. The inquisitors knew this. That is why they wrote everything down, page after page, parchment filled with confessions, accusations, lists of names. Ironically, it is these records meant to condemn that now serve as the most vivid testament to the Cathar presence. In their attempt to erase, the Inquisition preserved. But in the moment, for those who lived under its shadow, there was little comfort in that irony. The Inquisition was a slow suffocation, not the quick violence of war, but the patient extinguishing of breath, the gradual silencing of voices until only Rome remained. The castles had fallen, the fires had burned, but it was the Inquisition that ensured the Cathar faith would fade, not with a roar, but with a long, heavy silence. Long after the pyres dimmed and the tribunals closed their books, whispers still moved through the hills and valleys. They were faint, almost like dreams spoken half asleep, yet they carried something precious, the last traces of a faith that had nearly vanished. In the south of France, among the ruins of Languedoc's castles, villagers would point to stones and say, "Here the heretics prayed, the heretics." At night, when fires flickered low, elders told stories of men and women who faced death with calm, who walked into flames as if into the arms of light. These tales were hushed, never told too loudly, for even memory could be dangerous. Yet children grew up hearing them, not as sermons, but as legends, quiet songs of courage carried from one generation to the next. In Bosnia, too, echoes remained. Though the Bogomils had faced centuries of pressure, though empires rose and fell over their valleys, something of their spirit lingered. Travellers spoke of curious gravestones, tall and solemn, carved with strange symbols, suns, moons, stars, and figures with outstretched arms. Some said these stones marked the resting places of Bogomil believers, their faith etched into the earth when words could no longer be spoken aloud. Even when their names were forgotten, the stones stood like silent prayers, watching over the fields. Folklore carried hints as well. Songs about dual worlds, one of darkness, one of light. Tales of souls imprisoned in bodies, yearning to be free. Stories of simple, wandering preachers who shunned wealth and spoke of purity. These fragments, scattered like seeds, drifted through villages, sometimes blending into Christian tradition, sometimes standing apart like shadows. Even in the records of the Inquisition, meant to condemn, the traces endure. A woman confessing that she once gave bread to a perfecti. A farmer admitting he had listened to a sermon in secret. A child repeating words he had overheard from his parents. These moments, captured by hostile hands, are all that remains of countless lives. And though they were written to erase, they now bear witness. A strange, reluctant preservation of memory. The troubadour songs, too, carried echoes. While most verses praised earthly love, some hid a yearning for something higher, something beyond the flesh. Scholars wonder if, within those poems, the Cathar spirit lingered, cloaked in metaphor, disguised as romance, but reaching for transcendence. Even poetry may have been a refuge, a place where memory could hide safely, surviving in beauty. And so, the faith did not vanish entirely. It lived on in stones, in songs, in whispered tales. Not as a church, not as a power, but as a shadow that haunted Europe. Some said it resurfaced in later movements, among the reformers who challenged Rome, among the mystics who sought purity in simplicity. Others believed its essence slipped quietly into folklore, its fire reduced to embers but never wholly extinguished. Walking today among the ruins of Montségur, the stones still whisper. The wind that sweeps over the cliffs carries with it a silence heavy with memory. Tourists come climbing the steep path, unaware that each step follows the footprints of the faithful who once ascended to meet their fate. At the summit, where the fortress once stood, the sky opens wide, and one feels not just history, but presence, as if the voices of the perfecti still linger in the air. In Bosnia, too, the gravestones remain, weathered, cracked, leaning with age, yet still standing. They are called steci, and their carvings remain mysterious, their meanings debated. But to those who pause before them, they feel less like puzzles and more like prayers, last traces of a people who refused to be forgotten. Faiths rise, faiths fall, but memory drifts like smoke, clinging to the air long after the fire is gone. The Cathars and Bogomils may have been nearly erased, yet the earth, the stones, the songs, and the silence carry their traces. Gentle, faint, but enduring. Like a lullaby hummed by a grandmother to a drowsy child, the words may fade, but the melody lingers, comforting, haunting, eternal. Ideas, unlike armies, do not die on battlefields. They travel like seeds carried by the wind, settling in unexpected soil. Though the Bogomils and Cathars were silenced with fire and fear, something of their thought continued to wander. Not as a church, not as an unbroken lineage, but as an echo, faint, persistent, finding new voices in new times. Centuries after Montségur burned, Europe shifted. The medieval world began to crack, and questions long buried rose again. Why must the Church wield such wealth and power? Why must salvation pass only through its sacraments? Why should the faithful bow to men in robes of gold when the gospel spoke of humility and light? These were not new questions. The Bogomils had asked them in their villages and valleys. The Cathars had asked them in the courts of Languedoc. And though their names were forgotten, their spirits seemed to stir again when reformers began to speak. In the hushed gatherings of the Waldensians, one might hear a familiar tone: rejection of riches, a call to return to apostolic simplicity, a refusal to let the hierarchy dictate every step of faith. Though condemned as heretics themselves, they carried a flame that resembled the old one. Later, when the Reformation thundered across Europe, echoes grew louder. Martin Luther nailed his theses, railing against indulgences, against corruption. His words were not Cathar, not Bogomil, but the resonance was there. The same defiance, the same hunger for a purer faith. Others, like the Anabaptists, went further still, rejecting not only Rome but worldly powers, insisting on a faith lived in simplicity, separate from the corruption of society. In their voices, some heard the old whispers once more. Of course, history is never neat. The reformers did not descend directly from Cathars or Bogomils. Centuries lay between them, and the ideas were reshaped, reformed, reborn. But memory has strange ways of lingering. A rumour here, a tale there, a fragment of a manuscript tucked away, a chronicler's words rediscovered. Such things can keep ideas alive, if only as shadows. It is tempting to imagine ideas as wanderers themselves. Picture the dualist vision of light and darkness, weary from persecution, slipping through time like a cloaked traveller. It pauses with a group of Waldensians in the Alps, then moves on, listening as Protestants thunder against Rome, then drifts further still, finding a home among mystics who sought God not in power, but in silence. Always moving, always seeking, never entirely still. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Bogomils and Cathars, not a direct inheritance, but a spirit of questioning, a refusal to accept the world as it is handed down, a yearning for purity, for simplicity, for a light uncorrupted. Each age reshaped the yearning in its own image, but the yearning itself endured. Even today, in the ruins of Montségur or the Stetchi of Bosnia, modern seekers pause and feel a strange familiarity. They are not Cathars, not Bogomils, yet something in the silence stirs them, as if the old wanderer, the old echo, still lingers, waiting to be heard. History tends to remember the victors. Rome survived, Byzantium's power lingered, while the Bogomils and Cathars were nearly erased. And yet, here and there, in unexpected corners, the echo returns, not loudly, never loudly, but softly, like the rustle of a cloak, like footsteps vanishing around a corner. The Reformation may not have been their rebirth, but it was a reminder. Ideas cannot be burned so easily. They slip through fire, they hide in silence, they travel. And so the echo of Bogomils and Cathars, born in the Balkans and the hills of Languedoc, walked quietly into the Reformation, and perhaps still into us. The story winds down, dear traveller. The fires have burned out, the castles lie in ruin, and the Inquisitor's books gather dust. The names of the Bogomils and Cathars are rarely spoken, their faith seldom remembered. And yet, like a melody hummed at dusk, they linger, faint, fragile, but never wholly gone. In the Balkans, the mountains still cradle the silent gravestones of the Bogomils. Weathered by centuries of rain and wind, they lean like old guardians, their carvings softened but not erased. To pass among them is to walk through memory itself, a memory that refuses to bow to time. No priest stands to explain their meaning, no ritual is performed. Yet the stones speak in their own way, of a people who sought simplicity, who resisted the weight of empires, who believed that light dwelled within. In southern France, the ruins of Montségur crown the sky. Tourists climb the steep path, not always knowing the sorrow bound to those stones. At the summit, the wind is strong, the horizon vast. Standing there, one feels more than history. The silence carries a weight, as though the voices of the perfecti, calm even as the fire rose, still murmur in the air. They are gone, but their courage remains. Why remember them? Why tell the story of a faith erased, of a people nearly forgotten? Perhaps because their story is not only theirs, it is the story of all who dared to question, of all who chose conscience over command, of all who sought purity in a world heavy with corruption. The Bogomils and Cathars remind us that history is not only written by the victors, it is also carried in whispers, in stones, in the quiet persistence of memory. Their faith was branded heresy, their bodies burned, their songs silenced. And yet their existence still ripples through time, in reformers who sought simplicity, in mystics who sought inner light, in every soul who feels that truth is not always found in power, but in humility. Perhaps that is their gift, not survival as an institution, but survival as an echo, a soft reminder that another way once existed, a way of simplicity, of purity, of resistance. A way that said the kingdom of God is not built in gold or stone, but carried in the soul. As the centuries pass, the echo grows faint. Few remember the Bogomils by name. Few know the Cathars beyond legends. And yet, even in forgetting, something of them remains. For each time a person looks at the world and feels it must be more than what power declares, each time someone chooses compassion over cruelty, light over corruption, they walk, however briefly, beside those forgotten faiths. And so we end not with fire, not with ruin, but with quiet. The quiet of mountains where gravestones stand. The quiet of ruins high on a hill where the wind carries whispers. The quiet of memory which never fully dies. The Bogomils of the Balkans. The Cathars of Languedoc. Nearly erased yet not gone. Forgotten by books, remembered by stones. And perhaps, as you close your eyes tonight, you may hear their echo too, soft as a lullaby, gentle as a prayer, carried on the wind across centuries.